Hey everyone, Matt Meisenheimer here, and today I'm going to talk about composition. So I'm going to share with you one of my favorite techniques when I'm in the field. It's simple, it's easy to learn, and no matter your skill level, this is a technique you can use when you're out in the field to create great images. So I call it the anchor method, and it's really an extension of the rule of thirds. Now you might see photographers that are using this or aligning their images in a similar way to kind of this method I describe. I've just kind of labeled it the anchor method because it makes sense and make more sense to you as we go through it. So it is an extension of rule of thirds. Now basic rule of thirds states that if we divide the frame into basically 9 boxes, we've got two vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines, right? And rule of thirds, the basic idea is if you place a key element on those intersection points of those horizontal and vertical lines, you're just going to have a more dynamic image. It's going to be more interesting. It's a very easy and simple way to align elements. Now, I call this method the anchor method because what you're going to do is basically put your foreground element either on this lower intersection point or this one. And that foreground is going to anchor the scene for your focal point, right? It's going to act as an anchor in either the bottom left or the bottom right. So let's take a very basic scene. Let's say we have a mountain and a rock, right? So in the simplest sense, all I'm doing when I'm in the field and trying to align a composition is I'm going to put my rock in either one of these intersection points. Let's say right here. And then what I'm going to do is put my mountain on that other intersection point. And I apologize, this is why I'm a photographer and not a painter, but this is a really, really simple idea, right? You're just using a foreground element to anchor the scene for your focal point. This technique really has 2 advantages. It's creating depth, and it's doing that naturally because you have a foreground element that's closer to you, and there's a good transition to that focal point or that mountain that's further away in the distance. So you're creating some depth. Where this really shines though, or why this really shines, is you're creating really good geometric flow. You have this anchor point that's a little off-centered in one of your corners, and there's a really good connection via a line from secondary element or your foreground to kind of that main element in your composition. So this is something I use all the time. I'm anchoring the scene with a foreground element, and then I'm making sure I have a good line or good flow from that element to my focal point. So this is essentially rule of thirds, but like I said, you can probably, I call it the anchor method, and you can probably see why. So what I want to do is look at just a few of my images, and it'll make more sense, and I think it'll be easier to understand if we look at some real life examples. But this is something I use all the time. It works best in a horizontal frame. You can do it vertically, but I just don't do it much because with a horizontal frame, you just have more room, right? You have more room. These lines really shine when they have a little bit more distance to work with. So let's look at some examples. I'll show you some images of my own where I've used this technique. And I use this a lot because it is simple and it's really effective. So if you're just a beginner and you're out in the field and you're just starting to learn composition, try this out. And obviously I've been shooting for a long time and I still use this technique. Maybe I'm adding in some other things in terms of composition, but this is a really good place to start. So try out this anchor method.
Okay, let's take a look at some examples. Now, when I was going through some of my images for this video, I actually realized that some of my best images make use of this anchor method. So I thought that was pretty cool, and it's actually why I decided to do this video. So let's take a look at this image from Kauai. This is probably the best image I've ever created. I mean, the composition was great, the conditions were great, and I like how the processing turned out as well. But let's break it down into really simple terms with this method, right? We've got this tree, we've got the awesome Nepali coast. I know we've got the rainbows and everything too, but it's very simple. I anchored the scene with this tree. This is kind of a nice foreground. I even have a little bit of foreground framing here, but this is this main secondary element, right? So I've anchored the scene, and now there's a really good flow towards the Nepali coast, right? Towards that opening of light. And if I bring up rule of thirds, you can see it's not right on, it's not dead on those intersection lines, and that's okay. But the idea is there. I've got this anchor in the scene. We're moving from right to left. There's really nice flow in this composition. Okay, here's another one. Same thing, kind of the same setup, right? I've got this cascades in the bottom right, and that's kind of my foreground. I'm anchoring the scene with the cascades. There's really good flow towards this mountain in the background. And you can see the rainbow theme, at least for these last two images, is continuing. So the conditions are great. I mean, light makes a huge difference, but one of the best things we can do in the field is kind of control how these elements are placed. And I talked about earlier, you can do some other things with this method as well. In simple terms, you want to place something, one of those secondary elements or your foreground, on or close to these intersection lines. And then obviously you're going to contrast that with your main focal point. So I've got nice fall foliage here, right around this intersection point in the bottom left, a nice flow to the top right of the image, right? There's a nice line going on here. Great conditions as well. But there's another thing going on in this image, and this is what I meant when I said you can do some other things to make it a little bit more complex, is I'm actually using a line on the other side of the frame as well, right? I've got this stream coming in. So I have a couple different secondary elements, you could say. I've got this anchor point right here, and this is a strong line here, but then I also, from the opposite side in the bottom, I have another kind of secondary line coming in that's also pulling in the viewer to this great background, this mountain scene. So that's a way you can kind of add a little bit of complexity and, add a little extra to that composition. So find a key secondary element, right? I really think the fall color in this scene is the big one. And then the stream is kind of a complement, but you can see how they're working together, right? They're working together to pull in from the corners to the mountains. Okay, here's one from Nepal. This is actually pretty similar to what's going on in that previous image. I've got this shrub with snowfall anchored in that bottom right. I've got a nice line going to the light on the mountain, but then I also have this valley cutting in from the bottom left, and I just have two really nice lines that are kind of, again, pushing the viewer towards the background. And let's look at one more example here, because this is a little bit different too. The anchor method is still definitely at work here, because we have those cascades. There's really nice flow bottom left to top right. But you can see I've kind of stacked what's going on. So I'm actually using, you could call this like either a C or a bowl, but I've got my foreground really taking up the intersection point here, as well as that anchor point, and there's a nice line. This is why it's kind of called a C, or I guess a U-shaped composition. The line is flowing down here, coming up through the intersection point here, and then coming up to the mountains. So when we think of rule of thirds and this anchor method, in this composition here, all those intersection points are really at work. So it's hard to find a scene like this in nature. I mean, it definitely takes time. You're definitely not going to be able to find something like this for every single scene or landscape you shoot. But I hope you can see that this just works really, really well. I mean, we are literally hitting every intersection point. There's a great flow in this image. We do have some anchoring going on, but there's much more going on than just the cascade anchor and the mountains in the background, right? We've got nice overall flow. So, and you could even say that this stream coming in here over on the bottom right is also kind of leading into the glaciers in the mountains. So those are just some quick examples, but you can see how effective and how simple this anchor method is. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's simple, right? Find a foreground or a foreground element, a tree, a cascade, a flower, whatever you can find. Get it as close to one of those bottom intersection points as you can, and then just put, your focal point, your mountain, your desert view, whatever. Just have it contrast on those top intersection points, right? We want to set up flow from either the bottom left to the top right, or conversely from the bottom right to the top left.
So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this anchor method technique. I hope you learned something. Maybe this is something you've been doing subconsciously without thinking too much about it. It really is rule of thirds. I just like seeing it kind of laid out, seeing it in example images. It's a simple idea, but it's super effective, right? It simplifies the scene. It gives you good flow. It creates depth. It does a lot of things that we're trying to do when we go out there and shoot. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't used this technique or you're just kind of a beginner getting into it, try this out. Let me know how it goes. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And like I said, most importantly, I hope you learned something. So thanks everyone. Take care and we'll see you in the next video.